All right, we're going to call to order the Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, March 25th. Mr. Paulson, could you please call the order?
Commissioner Kane?
Here.
Commissioner Erickson?
Here.
Commissioner Hanson?
Here.
Commissioner Talasfor?
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Here.
Vice Chair Badami?
Here.
And Chair Birch.
Here. Thank you. I would ask everybody to please stand and join Commissioner O'Donnell in leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. The town of Los Gatos strongly encourages active participation in the public process, which is a cornerstone of democracy and essential to the Planning Commission conducting its business on behalf of the town council and the citizens of the town. There are several ways for members of the public to participate in this process. Written comments are always about an agenda item submitted to the staff prior to a meeting are always welcome and very helpful. At meetings of the commission, there are two opportunities for members of the public to participate. The first is during the verbal communications period, where an individual may speak on any topic which is not on the agenda, and any member of the public may speak during the public hearing of an agendized item. If you do wish to speak to the commission tonight, we're going to ask that you please fill out a speaker card. These are located in the back of the benches. Please be sure that when you come and speak, you state your name, address, and speak clearly into the microphone. Our first item is approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes for March 11, 2015. These meeting minutes were distributed to the commission in their packet. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Commissioner Talasfor?
Have any, but I'll be happy to make a motion for approval of those minutes.
First, first though, I need to inform the commission that while I was not present at the meeting, I've reviewed the tape and read the meeting minutes and feel that I can vote on this.
Okay.
So we have a motion.
So noted.
And a second. Commissioner Badami? All in favor?
Second.
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Are there any written communications this evening?
There is, I believe there was a disc item for, actually, sorry, that was for the workshop, not for the one.
That's why I paused too. I
Yeah.
thought so. Are there any requested continuances this evening?
There is requested continuance for item number 3, so if we could have a motion for that.
I have a motion to continue item number 3.
I'll move continue that matter, number 3, to a date certain. What is that date?
April 8th.
April 8th.
April 8th.
Great. Do we have a second? Commissioner Erickson? All in favor?
Aye.
In addition to their service on the Planning Commission, members of the commission serve on several town committees. Do we have any reports this evening? Commissioner Kane?
Commissioner O'Donnell and I attended the Historic Preservation Committee at 4 o'clock today, which was followed by the Housing Element Committee at 5:30, which is followed by the Planning Commission at at the Historic Preservation Committee meeting. We entertained a historic architecture and site application for 326 University. The application was approved 4-1. Under other business, an applicant from 145 Glenridge Avenue was given guidance on his modification of a previously approved design modification to a historic house. We also discussed the section of the code that provides for fines for misuse, misapplication of the language of historic demolition.
Thank you, Commissioner Kane. Do we have any other reports this evening? None? All right. We've come to the verbal communications portion of our meeting. Members of the public are invited to address the commission on any item which is not on tonight's agenda. And I do have one card. John Shepherdson. And your hula hoop.
John Shepherdson, 120 Oak Rim. So this is a hula hoop. I'm taking a hula hoop class, but actually I'm missing it tonight to be here. And I wanted to, it's actually quite fun, and I recently used it. My brother was in hospital at Stanford for a serious illness, and I brought this up there, and then I ended up giving a number of them away to the staff, and so it worked out quite well. I also think of the children, the foster children that are getting over-medicated. Maybe if we gave them hula hoops, it would be better for them. I also want to use this as a visual in terms of an issue in this town of the budgeting, our police department and whatnot. And so if we take like 15% of this circle, that is the New York City Police Department budget. If we take 20%, that's our national defense on the federal level. If we take 20%, it's Cupertino's police budget. If we take Saratoga's, I believe it's 26%. If we take Los Gatos, we go to 43%. And so what I'm suggesting is that we look at that, and is it a sound use of our town resources? We know that from an outside agency's evaluation, Saratoga is the safest city in the state. Cupertino is the 12th and 13th safest city, depending on the year. Los Gatos is not in the top 50. So, I wanted to reiterate that the former town, there's been a lot in the press about this, how much we're paying the interim town manager, which is $200,000, and we're paying our former town manager $200,000, and it's been in the press. And yet, I think if we could save perhaps $2 million a year annually, and we're talking about annually, that's a conservative number. We're talking about 10 years, $20 million. So I would, as leaders of the community, I just think that this is an important issue that I would encourage you to look in and explore, because I think it does impact issues like land use, property taxes, monies that we need for town resources and town government to operate. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherdson. Do we have any questions, Commissioner Erickson?
So with respect to your comments about the proportions of the budget, so just a question for you. Are you aware that the town of Los Gatos has no fire department, but the city of New York has a fire department? Are you aware that the town of Los Gatos has no recreation department and the city of New York has a recreation department? Are you aware that the city of Saratoga has a recreation department? Are you aware that the city and the town of Los Gatos does not? Are you aware that the city of Cupertino has a recreation department and a fire department in the town of Los Gatos? And are you aware of all those differences when you're making the comparisons? It's a yes/no question.
No.
Thank you.
And that's why I think we should look into it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We're now going to move into the public hearings portion of our agenda and consider agenda item number 1, which is an application for Town Code Amendment A-14-002, considering amendments to Chapter 26, Trees and Shrubs, and Chapter 29, Zoning Regulations, Tree Protection of the Town Code. Are there any disclosures at this point from any commissioners about this item? No? Mr. Cass, I understand you're going to be giving us the report again this evening?
That is correct. Thank you, commissioners. Third time here before the commission on the tree ordinance. I hope the third time is a charm. And we'll walk you through tonight's report regarding considering amendments to chapters 26 and 29 of the Town Code tree protection regulations. As you recall, on February 11th, the Commission held a public hearing to consider adoption of some various amendments to the Town Code relating to Chapters 26, which is Trees and Shrubs, and Chapter 29, Zoning Regulations, Tree Protection. Following discussion by the commission continued the public hearing to tonight's meeting on the 25th, but also scheduled a workshop on March 4th to further discuss and provide input to staff on various aspects of the tree protection ordinance and some of the proposed amendments and changes that we were considering. That was a very productive workshop, and I think we got a lot of good feedback from the commission. We had a good dialogue, and we made a number of modifications in response to the commission's input regarding the proposed changes to the tree protection ordinance. We also had a follow-up meeting. Director Pravetti and Planning Manager Joel Paulson met with Dr. Weissman as directed by the Planning Commission to discuss some of his concerns as a member of the public regarding hillside provisions and how the hillside component could be addressed more directly or more aggressively, if you will, as part of the tree protection ordinance. So what you have before you tonight is really the third iteration of the proposed changes to the two sections of the code, 29 and 26. And as we did with the workshop, we've highlighted in yellow the most recent set of revisions. All of the revisions are shown as either underlined for additions or strikeouts as deletions, but that last round of iterations that really came forward as a result of the workshop are shown in highlighted yellow, just to kind of pull those out for you. I'm going to go through those briefly and then be available to answer any questions that you might have or get any more feedback from the commission, and really follow along in the report as I address those issues. The first area where we've made some subsequent changes has been in the addition of a number of new definitions: heritage tree, hillside, large protected tree, multi-trunk tree, native, risk trunk, and trunk flare. And several of those definitions we also have made changes to the code, and those are really the substantive issues that we've added that I will address briefly following along in the report. So the first area is what is the scope of protected trees. So the scope of protected trees has been reduced for hillside, developed residential, meaning those trees that are covered as protected trees, from the current 12 inches to a narrower threshold of 8 inches. So what we believe is that addresses some of the concerns regarding the ability to identify these trees in the dormant season, the fact that the hillside woodland environment is a special, more fragile environment than the flatlands. And so we've brought that down to say that developed residential properties in the hillside, if your tree is 8 inches or greater, it's protected, and you have to go through the permit process for removing those trees. The flatlands, it's 12 inches. There's a few exceptions which are addressed in the code. I do want to point out that in the actual code, or excuse me, in the report, under the discussion of hillsides, we kind of incorrectly stated that reduction is in the special hillside provision. It's actually in the protected tree section of going from 12 to 8, but that's just doesn't affect the actual code itself. It's just how we wrote it up in the report. Secondly, and again, some of these came out both from the commission, but as well with the discussion with Dr. Weissman in response to some of the hillside issues that he was concerned about. The second area where we've made a change is that we've expanded the exceptions to allow in the hillsides any eucalyptus tree 24 inches or less to be removed without a permit. Previously, there were only 2 species of eucalyptus trees which we were saying could be removed at the 24-inch threshold or less, which was the blue gum and the red gum. After discussion with Dr. Weissman and discussion among staff, we felt that it was reasonable, because they're non-natives, to expand that up to 24 inches in the hillsides. A lot of discussion throughout this process has been the definition of heritage trees. That's sort of the fourth item here of the items in the staff report. And again, that actually was really the catalyst of one of the directions from the council of why we even took on this whole amendment, is that the council wanted us to develop a definition of heritage trees. So in response to the commission's discussion, what we have done is we've included a definition of heritage trees, which really is a tree that's specifically designated by action of the town council on the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Committee. And we discussed this in the workshop, but that now is included in the code as one of the changes that we're recommending. Now, we don't have a process yet for going through and designating heritage trees, and a number of jurisdictions have various different processes. They can be self-nominated, they can do an annual process of going through and identifying trees, public trees, or even trees on private property. What we're doing is we're setting up that definition, we're reserving it, and really it would be the council that would want to sort of pull the trigger on asking staff to come up with a process to identify and designate trees that would meet that special criteria as heritage tree. We don't have that yet, but we do have this definition in the code. So that's the heritage tree component. But in addition, as a result of this process, what we've done is we've really now crafted and carved out this other category of tree, which initially we were calling it heritage tree, and then the commission said, well, how about notice tree? But we've come up with, it's not an elegant term, but large protected tree, because really that's simply what it is. It's a large protected tree. And that's that category of trees which are now going to be subject to a public noticing process, which previously the town code and the tree removal process had no public noticing involved unless there was an appeal for the tree removals. So we're now calling trees that are over a certain diameter threshold large protected trees. There's specific process that people who want to prune or remove those trees have to follow as part of the code. And the key thing, and this is really probably one of the most significant changes that we're recommending, is there's now a public noticing process. If somebody wants to remove a large tree, there has to be notification of abutting property owners. And as I said, currently there is no notification process required. The threshold is 48 inches in diameter, so that's a pretty good sized tree, except for oaks, buckeyes, and madrone, which are slower growing and have a 24-inch diameter threshold. And in deference to the Iowa Buckeyes. Now I finally got the joke after the third time that
Ohio State.
See, I still didn't get the joke. Okay, Wisconsin Badgers. How about that? Okay, Ohio State Buckeyes. Iowa's Hawkeyes. Okay, right? Is that right? Hawkeye and Buckeye. All right. Okay, enough. That's enough digression there. I thought I had that one, but I guess I didn't. All right. I know. I have to come back for 3 more times with the commission. All right. The other thing that we did, which really came apart as a part of the workshop and also the discussions with Dr. Weissman, was really adding a definition of hillsides in the code. So we've pulled out, we've added a definition of hillside, and we've added a special code provision that's titled Special Provisions Hillsides. There are a number of additional criteria in that section regarding replanting with natives, removals within the 30-foot zone, within the zone 30 feet and further, and really links this code much more closely to our hillside development standards and guidelines than previously. So we're very comfortable with what we have done. We feel that it meets the direction from the commission and also helps support our town's effort to look at the hillsides differently and promote the restoration of hillsides and the retention of the native woodland areas in our hillsides. Next area is tree risk rating and emergency action. And as we discussed at the workshop, we've made some changes to that. We've clarified the language. Some of that's in the definitions, but we've made an effort to really kind of draw some limits along the lines of when a tree can be removed for an emergency reasons, and we've linked it to this ISA tree rating matrix. And again, we discussed that, I think, in some detail at the workshop. We've also put that additional finding in that allows for a finding that if a tree is going to be replaced with a more appropriate species that will help enhance the urban forest, that finding can be made. Again, it has to be made within the context of considering all the other aspects, but the example is, a crepe myrtle that might be in somebody's yard and they want to replace it with an oak tree. And even though the crepe myrtle's healthy, currently we would be reticent to approve the removal of it. Under this provision, we can make a finding that replacing a tree that's really maybe not contributing as significantly to the urban forest as a replacement one would be a reason for removal. There was a discussion at the workshop of having a replacement tree list that would be similar to the master tree list for street trees. We discussed this a lot among staff about how much do we want to get involved in really kind of managing the types of trees that people plant. In the hillsides, we have the hillside development standards, so we're pretty clear on what kind of trees people can plant in the hillsides. However, in the flatlands, we backed off on that and felt that we really didn't think that was something that was a list that we want to develop and tell people you can or cannot plant these trees within the flatland areas. And again, that dialogue occurs with the town arborists and replacement when trees are removed, but we are not recommending a replacement tree list for broadly for the whole town. That's it. I have a few concluding comments, and again, our recommendation is that you forward a recommendation on these amendments to the town council, make some findings, and it's the standard actions that the commission makes. But I do want to kind of bring this back to what the genesis of this effort was, and the genesis really was from the council, and as I mentioned in my presentation, establish a heritage tree definition, and also review and refine these pruning regulations that we're currently at, like you can't prune more than 25% of a tree. And we really had those only two narrow things, but to really use a kind of a metaphor, we really wanted to see the forest for the trees here. And we wanted to look at the code. I had to say that. I mean, I think this is absolutely what we did. We could have just said heritage tree and pruning and then not looked at the rest of the code and not looked at the process and not looked how we're dealing with it. But we did want to look a little more holistically at this. And I think this process worked really well. We got good feedback. It was a collaborative process with the commission. I think the end product after this now third iteration of coming to the commission is much better than the initial version that we came up with. There's always it could be a little better here. There's always this elegance creep, and where do you stop when you're trying to get the perfect language for every sentence in the code? And at some point, you need to move forward and move on, and I think we're at that point now. And I think that, again, we've done a good job, and I think it's been collaborative, and I think we have a much better ordinance related to tree protection. So with that, I'll answer any questions, and if there's any other comments from my colleagues in the Community Development Department, I will defer to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cass. Commissioner Talasfor?
So in your concluding remark, you said you're feeling very good about this. So what I wanted to know is, just as a general question before anyone gets into specifics, in general, this changes to the ordinance today will better assist and help you implement, what we're looking for here in town prior to what we had.
Absolutely. I think it gives a lot more clarity to the staff, both in community development as well as the Parks and Public Works staff in reviewing tree removal permits. It provides these standards of review that are clear, required findings. It will, hopefully make, and I'm optimistic that it will be a more manageable process for staff and clear for the public as well as to what's the criteria with which a tree can be removed or cannot be removed. I mean, there's still going to be the occasional tree removal permit that's going to get appealed to the commission, and there's still provisions for that.
Sure. So Just a follow-up question. There was a term in here in one of the findings, and I just, if you could help me with, understand it, and it's called, it is, well, I had it right here, just a second. It is the, where's our finding? It is the here it is. It's under section 29100992, required findings.
Correct.
It's on page 12 of our packet tonight. And number 4, can you explain just a little bit more to me, because I don't know I think I know what this means, but I'd like to be more specific about it. The retention of the tree restricts the economic enjoyment of the property.
Well, and again, I think that's a really reasonable one to ask some questions about, because it is a finding that I anticipate will be made in some of the tree removal requests. An example would be if every neighbor up and down a street could put in a pool in their backyard, and you wanted to put a pool in your backyard, but you had a large cedar tree in your backyard. Healthy cedar tree, smack in the middle of the backyard. Maybe you didn't plant it, but when you bought the house, it was there. And you'd like to put a pool in your backyard. Well, under the current ordinance, there was no provision for saying you could remove that cedar tree so you could put a pool in there. Well, you have an economic, you're not being able to use your property to the same economic standard that your neighbors may be able to use the property. Now, you still have to go through a permit process. We still have to look at the tree, and if the tree was a 350-year-old oak tree, we might, from a staff standpoint, say, we're sorry, that tree trumps the fact that you want to put a pool in your backyard because it is so significant, it is so contributing to the environment that we would want that one to come to the commission or to the council to determine whether or not it was appropriate. But again, the example which I like to use is if your neighbor can put a pool in, your other neighbor can put a pool in, and you're stuck with a big cedar tree or a big redwood tree in the middle of your backyard, that's the definition of economic enjoyment of the property. At least one definition of it. Does that give you a...
That's so it could be not just for a developer who wanted to develop a large piece of property, but it could, or a small, an acre for a private builder, but also for anyone who wants to change their landscaping in there or add something to their landscape.
It could be. It could be.
Could be all of those things. So so going back to the heritage then, if that cedar tree happened to be characterized as a heritage tree, because you said those heritage trees could be on both public and private property?
Again, we don't have a process for heritage tree, but it could be. Theoretically, if it was a heritage tree that was planted by Harry Truman, it might get designated as a heritage cedar. And
just wondering what we might be looking at.
The process would, the difference would be, there would be a noticing process. Now, if that cedar tree currently was bigger than 48 inches in diameter, all the neighbors are going to get notified that, neighbor A wants to remove that tree to put in a pool or re-landscape their backyard, and everybody would have a chance to comment on that.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Erickson, did you have a question?
So I had a comment and a question for the chair that I could either ask the staff person or if the chair didn't want me to. So my comment is, I think that the staff, and Bob in particular, did an exceptional job of rewriting chapter 26 and 29, and it was one. My question is this, and we can either do this now or later, defer to the chair. I would be interested to know, there are about 10 or 12 points that David Weissman articulated that weren't incorporated, and it would be helpful to me. I'm not judging whether they should be in or not, but it would be helpful to me to understand from the staff why they chose not to include them in each case. It would be helpful just to walk through that. So I could either ask that question, Bob, now, or we could wait till deliberations to do that.
So we only have one speaker card. Why don't we go ahead and do the speaker, and then we can discuss that further? Okay. Commissioner Hanson?
I was just interested in understanding because I realize the heritage tree hasn't been defined yet, and there's going to be a process for it, but what your view would be of what's the overlap between a large protected tree? Because the trees I saw on that list were likely to be a heritage tree anyways, so how would you see there being a big overlap once the heritage tree is actually developed with the same? It doesn't change the findings or the requirements for pruning, but it just in terms of trying to understand how this gets mapped out.
You know, it really depends on the criteria that we would develop for designating a tree as a heritage tree. So, for example, the cedar tree in the town plaza that we use for the annual holiday lighting. I don't know if that's 48 inches or not in diameter. It may not be, but it may be a tree that we want to have as a heritage tree because it's got some community significance, so there may not be an overlap in a situation like that. There likely would be trees that would likely become a heritage tree might be large specimens of trees, which would already be characterized as large protected trees, but it provides another level of overlay. And I think that although the code, it doesn't have more restrictions on a heritage tree than it does on a large protected tree, from the standpoint of the environmental review process and the disclosures, the fact that it's been a designated heritage tree adds another layer of importance to it.
Oh, okay, so just going down that path, a year from now we have the heritage tree definition. So is there any reason that there could be a conflict? Like the tree, there's a 50-inch oak tree and it now becomes a heritage tree. Is there any reason that them being in both categories could create
there's no
conflicts?
Conflict because there's nothing. No, there's no conflict.
I didn't see any, but
Yeah.
I wanted to just see, looking down the road, is it going to require another code revision? It sounds like we'll be okay.
It's conceivable that with the heritage tree designation process, instead of the large protected trees, the noticing is the abutting properties. It may be that if somebody wanted to remove a heritage tree, the council might say, gee, we want a 300-foot noticing for anything that's a designated heritage tree. So it is conceivable as we go through the process to develop the designation procedures that we might layer on another series of sort of requirements, and the noticing would be the one that would immediately come to mind for me.
For the heritage
For
tree
the heritage
versus
tree.
the large protected
The
tree.
heritage tree.
Commissioner Kane?
Mr. Cass, our job here is to recommend to Town Council approval of the attached ordinance. And in the vein of recommending, if the commission does not disagree, and if you and staff do not disagree, that we recommend Town Council recognize Dr. Weissman for his contribution for the past number of weeks on this issue, and in general, his developing expertise and advocacy for the trees of Los Gatos. So if you think that's appropriate, and if the commission thinks that's appropriate, maybe a kind word or a commendation from Town Council would be in order.
I certainly think that is something that staff could look at.
Well, that's clearly an option for the commission this evening. That can be part of the recommendation.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? No? All right, we have one speaker card for this item tonight. That would be Lee Quintada.
Lee Quintana. Good evening. I just have a few things to say. 5 Palm Avenue, although I now understand that it's not required to give addresses. So, but I will, 5 Palm Avenue. I'd just like to say that I think that this has been a very good collaborative process, and I'd like to see more processes like this. I would also like to ask the Commission to seriously consider the recommendations by Dr. Weissman. I like Mr. Kane's suggestion regarding David Weissman. David Weissman has been involved in the hillside and trees in the hillside for as long as I have known him, which is probably as long as I've lived here, which is 40 years. So he's been very involved in this issue, and I do believe that it would be appropriate to give him some recognition. And I do believe that you should consider his suggestion seriously. In addition, I have two other personal comments to make. One is in respect to noticing adjacent homeowners for tree removals, not just for large tree removals, although for non-large tree removals, just the adjacent homeowners would probably be adequate. And the reason why I ask for this is that when a tree is removed, particularly if it's quite a mature tree, particularly if it's at the edge of a property, the removal of that tree can have effects on the adjacent properties and the adjacent property owners. It can change the environment of the neighbor's yard and, in essence, require a re-landscaping because the plants that were there that received shade may no longer receive shade and therefore will die. And it also may affect whether or not an adjacent house gets sun in the summer, which they didn't previously have, which would affect their comfort in their home. So that's why I request that. And lastly, and I don't know if this falls under this particularly, I'm going to speed up my speech. In the past, we have used redwoods as screening trees, often between properties that have 8-foot or 5-foot side setbacks, which to me is the prescription for trouble in the future. And I'm wondering whether something can be added into this or some other appropriate place that would not allow that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Commissioner Kane?
Yeah. Ms. Quintana, on notifying adjacent neighbors, what did you say? How far out did you want the notices to go?
Just the adjacent neighbors, the ones on the sides, the back, and if the tree is large and might shadow across the street, directly across the street, not your normal expanse. And the reason I say that is that I understand that even in those cases, if the tree removal is approved, a notice will go out to the normal noticing of neighborhoods, I believe, to notify them that an approval has been made, and unless they appeal it, it will be approved. But this might prevent appeals from neighbors in the future if there could be some kind of discussion beforehand between them.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? All right. Now I'm going to close the public portion of the public hearing and ask if any commissioners have any questions of staff, comments, would like to make a motion. Mr. Erickson, I know that you wanted to continue the discussion. Would you like to do that now as far as Dr. Weissman's letter?
Sure, it'd be great if the staff could respond, and I would suggest to the staff that the answers be 30 words or less each, because I believe some of them are self-evident, but I would request that you be very succinct and to the point, and if we don't think you gave us an adequate answer, we'll ask you to use more than 30 words.
So, Madam Chair, if it's okay, I will start, and then Mr. Cass may augment some of my comments. So, Dr. Weissman's letter is contained in Exhibit 14. Item 1 regards exceptions. Since the publication of the letter, we actually did include eucalyptus species in the hillsides as a way of encouraging the removal of non-native. We felt something too general would be very difficult to implement, but we thought the comment about eucalyptus in the hillsides was warranted, so that it is in your draft. Item 2 has to do with determination of tree removals when there's not yet an application for development, and his concern is that we should really allow dead trees to remain because of their ecological benefits. from a practical standpoint, staff felt that, property owners may still want to manage their land, and if they go through a process to remove the tree, you have the findings and the standards of review, so it could still be done in accordance with the ordinance, so we didn't need to make any special provisions for that circumstance. Item 3 really pertains to grading, is the kind of the underlying issue, and how we might want to protect the understory species. Again, this is a tree protection ordinance, not an understory ordinance. We have a separate work item that Parks and Public Works is working with Community Development on the grading ordinance. That work will get started again, so we'll have a chance to review these particular issues in that context. The next item 4 talks about an issue that you've seen before with respect to how homes could change their size and shape to better accommodate existing trees. Really, that's an issue that happens through the development review process, so it doesn't appear to be appropriate for the tree protection ordinance. Item 5, again, the policy should be that the trees be given the benefit of the doubt, but really we don't have years to make our decisions. Usually we try and be a lot quicker than that. So again, the standards of review and the findings were intended to help facilitate that. But again, we do, as appropriate, we may need a consulting arborist report, and if in their professional opinion the tree could recover, then you would have that information to consider. New development, the thought was that 1 year is too short and a 5-year maintenance agreement might be better. This is really a policy call. The 1 year is the existing, so we just thought we should just hold with what we already have. The commission, if it wishes, could recommend something higher. The items,
I'm sorry, was that your only, because you already have a policy like that, that was your only objection to not including or expanding the years?
Well, again, I wouldn't say that we objected to the items in this letter. It was really, he was raising policy issues that really went beyond the scope of the ordinance, and so we didn't want to overstep our boundaries by saying, yes, let's do all of it. So we encouraged Dr. Weissman to submit the letter so that way the Planning Commission, as a recommending body, could make some of those policy calls, and that is one that, you're free to make. Item 7 is an interesting point in terms of story pole. So here he's thinking perhaps we should include an exception for story pole ropes because they're temporary and they really shouldn't affect the tree. So that's a consideration, and maybe Mr. Paulson has something to add on that.
Yeah, I think the other general would be, that's not something that we typically see, is that story pole supports are attached to trees, but if someone was to attach them to trees, staff would work with them to probably provide some kind of barrier so the rope is not directly on the trunk. So that's something that we're not necessarily sure needs to be in the code, but if that's something the commission would like in there, we can definitely add that.
Item 8 has to do with enforcement, and I know that is a concern of the community. Enforcement's really kind of a separate issue, and we believe that the code as proposed has sufficient enforcement parameters. Item 9 is related. What's a definition of violation? It's helpful in terms of implementation to have the flexibility to determine violations. Really, anything that's contrary to the code is a violation, and if we define it more specifically, we could in fact inhibit enforcement. So that was our thought there. Again, 2-year versus 5-year maintenance agreement under item 10. It's a policy issue for your consideration. And then he's got 2 general comments about hillside lots not having sufficient space for the trees. So again, he's thinking that, perhaps the arborist could assist in the locations for tree placement. And then he had a comment about director, but again, I think for town operations, we're comfortable that the way it's written will suffice for both implementation and enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. We have any further questions on the letter or comments? Commissioner Kane?
I'm ready to make a motion
Okay.
through the chair. I move that we recommend to Town Council approval of the attached ordinance amendments to Chapter 26 and Chapter 29 of the Town Code. I find there's no possibility that this project will have a significant impact on the environment. Therefore, the project is not subject to CEQA. And I find that we make the finding that the Town Code amendments are consistent with the general plan if the recommendation is for adoption. And I recommend that we add to the revised Town Code, asking staff to find a way to incorporate item 6 of Dr. Weissman's letter and item 10 of Dr. Weissman's letter, providing the standard for tree maintenance go to 5 years instead of 1, especially since it was at one time 5 years. And if there are other amendments to crossing Ts and dotting Is, I'm open.
Commissioner Talsfor?
I'll go ahead and second that motion. I don't know how we could put this in there, but a point was made tonight about using redwood trees as screening trees in neighborhoods. We seem to see a lot of those as problems today. I don't know, staff, can you give me some advice on that, or how would that be handled?
Well, I think, our town arborist has the experience in terms of how to advise homeowners as they're looking at replacement trees, should they contact the town for that type of guidance. And I think our own experience and his own experience would say, there are other species that could perhaps better meet that need. I guess it's really a matter of, is the commission comfortable with that being advice provided on a customer service basis as opposed to it being legislated in the code? So that would be a way of distinguishing, and we could still provide that advice without it being in the code.
Okay, so maybe on a list of trees you might want to avoid. Okay.
All right, do we have any other comments before we vote? Commissioner Badavi?
I'd also like some consideration given to Dr. Weissman's letter on section number 4, the standards of review, item number 6. And the reason why I have pause on that, and I'd like to see how my other commissioners feel about this, is that there seems to be a conflict with the intent of protecting trees with a contradiction in removing trees. We're actually promoting maximum development intensity without consideration for possibly changing the size, shape, and location of a house. And I did do some research with the city of Saratoga, who does not contain this provision at all, with that 25% building envelope restriction, and the city of Palo Alto, which does address it, but limits it to projects other than single-family residential. So I looked to my other commissioners to see if they might consider removing item number 6, because it's somewhat addressed in item number 4 if somebody wanted to expand beyond the 25% envelope.
Can you do that again?
I'm sorry?
Can you point that out? Be specific with what you're saying.
Okay, so under the standards of review on page 11, item number 6, and Dr. Weissman addresses this in his letter to us. Do we need to have item number 6 in there? Because in some respects, we're promoting cutting down trees and not preserving them, whereas maybe a lot cannot be developed to a maximum FAR, and we're not supposed to develop the FAR as a goal.
So that's that.
Sorry, well, Commissioner O'Donnell and then Commissioner Talsfor.
I think it's useful because trees are important to people. House is nice to know if the the tree takes up more than 25% of their building area, they ought to be able to remove the tree. And it's a fairly simple statement, but if the tree is more important than the people, then you can change it. But so far, we have used that kind of rationale repeatedly, and I think it works very effectively. And so I don't think that promotes the removal of a tree any more than simply saying there has to be a good reason to remove a tree. And I think in general, it's always about what does that mean? What does it mean to say there must be a good reason? And here we're saying a good reason is that it reduces your otherwise permissible building envelope by more than 25%. I think it's a very helpful thing. If you think 25% is the wrong number, maybe we should talk about that. But when people want to build a house, I just as soon not make it any more complex than it already is. So this I find to be a helpful addition.
Commissioner Talsfor, you had a comment?
How are you seeing that as something that's troubling you? Can you give us an example? Maybe that would help.
Well, on a hillside lot, which tend to be larger lots typically, and you've got a beautiful coast oak sitting in the middle or maybe to a third of the lot, and maybe somebody wants to build a 6,000 square foot home. Perhaps they can build a 5,000 square foot home with the goal of retaining the nice oak and still enjoy the economic viability of the lot.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
We have the hillside ordinance, which deals with first ascertaining where you can build a house. So if it were a 1 acre lot, it doesn't mean you have a 1 acre building site. So the first thing you have to figure out is where the building site is, and we know how you do that. And then you say a 6,000 square foot house, that assumes we approve a 6,000 square foot house. And in not approving a 6,000 square foot house, we could say, we don't see why you need that in light of what you're doing to the trees. We could already do that. So 6,000 square foot house, as I recall, and maybe I'm recalling it incorrectly, in the hills is not a matter of right. I thought the cutoff, we had to make a finding on 6,000. Is that the wrong number?
No, that's...
So 6,000 is technically the maximum FAR in the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines. You can make a finding to exceed that number. I think just for the Commission's consideration, it's the Hillside's one example, which typically would have a bigger building envelope. The LRDA may be smaller. So this, I think, specifically talks to permissible building envelope. So we would probably have to look to legal counsel for that type of interpretation. I think it's really when you get to the smaller lots, when you've got R1D lots that are 5,000 square feet, you've got a much smaller building envelope. So if a tree takes up more than 25%, is that reasonable to keep this existing requirement in there? And so I just offer that for the Commission's consideration.
Well, and the buildable portion of the lot, as I recall, because we have those problems of saying on a hillside lot, the viewing platform and all that. So a lot of times we center restrictively the building area by a number of environmental considerations, not the least of which is the visual. And so it seems to me if we go through that process and I'll say, oh, wait a minute, by the way, there's a tree here, I think the 25% reduction is helpful, and it's not like we haven't gone through a fairly extensive process in the first place to find the buildable site. So again, I mean, obviously reasonable minds can differ, but I think this is helpful to people, and I don't think it would have any substantial effects. For example, if you had a heritage tree, that would be a total different ballgame.
Another option for the Commission's consideration, if the issue really is with the hillsides, then perhaps one way of perhaps addressing it would that you would retain item 6, but that you would say this would not be considered in hillside locations as defined by the hillside standards. So if the valley floor example that Mr. Paulson mentioned seems reasonable, then perhaps this criterion would work. But if you're worried that it could be applied in hillside locations where you have a very different context, that could be an edit that you could suggest, or the maker of the motion could suggest.
Well, I look to my other commissioners for their input, if they have any, other than Commissioner O'Donnell.
Well, I liked what Ms. Privetti, is that, are you
I would be
specifically
amenable to
looking
that.
at the hillside?
I'm very concerned with the hillsides.
Okay, I could see, well, I'm not the maker of the motion, so we'll let take that
Would the
from there.
maker of the motion be willing to include that as part of his motion?
Yes.
Great.
As well, the seconder.
Wonderful. Thank you. Do we have any other comments before we vote? We have Commissioner Hanson.
I just had a question. I forgot to write down what you said on Dr. Weissman's point 11. I know you had a reason for not including it, but I didn't write it down, and so that. I thought his suggestion was a good one because I do think that's an issue for people not having a lot of tree expertise, not about where to put the trees and.
Yeah, and again, I think the town arborist is available for consultation as appropriate as our other arborists, private arborists. Again, I think the distinction is, do we need to legislate it in the code, or is the commission comfortable with the arborist just providing professional guidance on a one-on-one basis to homeowners?
For me personally, I'd prefer to have it in there because otherwise, other than committing to planting the trees, they could be put anywhere, and it might not be the right thing to do. I would prefer to have it spelled out, but I don't know if other commissioners feel the same way.
Was that an offer to the maker of the motion?
I believe
Are you
she's
willing
asking
to
the
amend
maker
the
of the motion.
motion?
Not at this time. I think it would run the town arborist ragged. The intention is excellent. The application, I don't think is that practical or necessary. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any more discussion before we vote? Commissioner O'Donnell?
I just have a question of staff. If we essentially amend section 2910-0990, which we've been talking about, page 11, subparagraph 6, as suggested, I assume that just means that one could find that a tree could be cut down, but not simply because it interfered with more than 25% of the property. Is that right? Okay, thank you. That's fine.
In the hillside.
Yes.
In the hills.
And that was my intent.
Okay. All right. Great. We have a motion. We have a second. Do we have all in favor? Aye. Passes unanimously. Good
Thank
job,
you,
Mr.
Mr.
Cass. And I assume since this is a recommendation to council, there's no appeal or anything, right? It's okay. All right. We'll now consider agenda item number 2, which is an application for a tree removal permit, T14-004. This is an appeal for a decision to deny a tree removal permit on property zoned C-1, APN 529-34-018. May I have a show of hands of the commissioners who have visited the property? All right. Do we have any disclosures on this item? No? Miss, I hope I'm
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kane.
Well, disclosures, I visited the property. I had discussions with Sean, one of the applicants, and I'll tell you before he does that in inspecting the tree, it tripped me and knocked me over. So I'll get that out of the way now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kane. And I hope I'm going to pronounce your last name properly. Is
It's
it
okay if you don't.
Puga?
Yes,
Great. Thank you. I understand you're going to give us the report this evening.
correct. Good evening, Commissioners. On January 8th, 2014, the Public Parks Department received a tree removal application to remove a 49.5-inch redwood tree. The property owner requested the removal of the tree based on current damage to the existing sidewalk and the potential for structural damage to the building. On September 10th, 2014, the town arborist conducted a site inspection and issued the permit. The length of time between the submittal of the application to the date of the inspection was atypically long, because town staff was working with the applicant to submit an arborist report and accounts for a time in which the applicant was out of town. Subsequently, the permit was rescinded on October 27th, 2014, and the property owner appealed the decision on November 19th, 2014. The town's consulting arborist conducted a site visit as part of the appeal process and found the tree to be healthy, but pose a threat due to its large size and proximity to the building. The consulting arborist noted damage to the concrete sidewalk will be a recurring problem, but found no compelling evidence of damage to the foundation of the structure due to the tree. The consulting arborist recommended further excavation alongside the building foundation to accurately determine whether foundation damage had occurred. Based on the recommendation of the consulting arborist, the soil alongside the building foundation was excavated roughly 12 inches below the top of the slab. The applicant's structural engineer conducted an additional site inspection and found no damage to the foundation of the building, although only the top few inches of the footing were visible. The consulting arborist completed an addendum to the report. No excavation to expose the bottom of the footing as recommended had been performed. The addendum found that if concrete or another type of pavement sidewalk is installed in the same location, the damage will be a recurring problem. However, the possibility of foundation damage cannot be determined without further excavation that was not completed. The consulting arborist reviewed several alternatives for mitigating the situation, but none were considered viable to provide the required Title 24 accessibility standards to access the suite. Based on the finding of the consulting arborist, staff recommends the appeal be granted and that the canopy replacement be provided pursuant to town code requirements. The Parks and Public Works Department are present this evening for any questions you may have. This concludes staff's report, and we are available for any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions of staff? Commissioner O'Donnell?
I'm sorry, you may have said this. It's not unusual. The town declined to issue a permit for tree removal, and you're recommending that we grant the appeal. And would you explain to me why that's done that way?
So the decision for the tree removal application was initially approved by the Parks and Public Works Department. It was then rescinded by the Parks and Public Works Director. The applicant then appealed it to the Planning Commission, and as staff looked at the application further, especially the sidewalks, initially the foundation damage was what staff had looked at the most, and that was undetermined based on all of the reports we'd received. But when we looked further at the sidewalk damage, we took into consideration Title 24 accessibility standards, and even if the sidewalk location was to be moved, the sidewalk would still have recurring damage based on the size of the tree and the size of the roots. And so that's why staff is recommending the appeal be granted.
Commissioner Kane?
Well, along those lines, in looking at the original tree removal application and permit, which had been initially approved, it's filled out in some detail, but down near the middle it says decision rescinded. Boom. I don't think that's the way I would wonder if in the future the citizen could be given a reason, especially if there's going to be redress, because it doesn't give us anything to work on. So that's a consideration or a suggestion. But I do have a question. At the bottom of the form, when it was presumed that the tree removal request was going to be granted, someone wrote in replacement tree requirement, 3 24-inch box trees on property. So if this request for removal is approved, will that condition still apply?
So the replacement is based on the tree protection ordinance, our canopy replacement table. So based on the canopy of the existing tree, that would determine how many trees would be replaced. And based on the existing code, it would require 3 24-inch box trees.
This would apply.
Right. We have another Commissioner Hanson.
So I would like to hear more about why the permit was rescinded. Do we need to request that, or, I mean?
Good evening, Matt Morley, Director of Parks and Public Works. The tree permit was rescinded as we had discussions following the initial evaluation. with the town arborist on the condition of the tree. Based on the arborist and even the consulting arborist, subsequently, the tree was in a healthy condition and in good shape. And only after substantial work at pulling up sidewalk and looking at the root structures, even then it was in question as to whether there was root damage that was being done to a structure. And ultimately, the Title 24 accessibility standard was looked at from the Community Development Department as an option for removing it. But based on the work with the arborist, there was nothing wrong with the tree that would warrant its removal based on the current code.
I thought there was a provision in the current code for structural damage as a finding to justify a tree removal. So, but structural damage there, maybe not to the foundation, but definitely to the sidewalk. And so I'm not sure. So you're saying
in the Parks and Public Works world, we replace sidewalk on a regular basis that's damaged by tree roots. So it wasn't something that we would consider a reason for removing a tree. We would leave the tree and accommodate the tree with the sidewalk, and that would be the case in a situation like this. Other than subsequently finding the accessibility standards being at play.
Commissioner Talasfor?
And I also noticed that the arborist suggested 3 24-inch box trees. And when I am on that site and looking just in this photograph, I mean, how does he determine that? It seems to me 3 24-inch box trees are going to really, I mean, there's a lot of trees here.
So there are provisions for not actually planting those trees on site. So the ordinance is fairly straightforward on measuring the tree canopy, the existing tree canopy size, and prescribing what the replacement canopy is, the replacement tree requirement is, and that is to retain the overall canopy within the town. In a case like this where there's not enough room on the property, we would expect that, although we provide the opportunity for the trees to be planted on site, that there may be a contribution to our tree replacement fund that would serve to plant those trees elsewhere within the town.
And can I ask a question? Does the town buy the 24-inch box trees, or does the applicant actually go out and choose them and replace them? And I can't remember.
If the applicant were to plant them on site, the applicant would purchase them.
Okay.
Otherwise, the applicant has the option of paying into the tree replacement fund, in which case the town would do the actual purchasing and planting at an alternate location.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I do. So I know that it says you guys went 12 inches down, and it was requested, I can't remember, to go to the bottom of the footing to verify structural damage, and that was not done?
That's correct.
So at this point, while we're seeing damage to sidewalk, there is no proof of structural damage to the facility?
That is correct.
Okay. Commissioner O'Donnell?
If I understood you correctly, you said, however, subsequent to that, some consideration was given to what I presume to be the ADA requirements or something, and at that point, the bulk of the tree and the location of the tree you felt might be violative of the ADA?
So ultimately, it's the effect that the tree roots have on the pathway. So it was determined that there's no way to bring in an accessible path to the building.
We had a commissioner fall down to prove it, right?
Apparently.
Thank you.
As a rule, if this is on private property and the upheaval is on a sidewalk in a private property, it is the property's owner's responsibility to ensure that the sidewalk is kept level and ADA compliant. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Thank you. So I do have a card from the applicant who has stated that he is available for questions. Do we have any questions for the applicant at this time? No? Okay. Commissioner O'Donnell? When you come to the podium, would you please state your name and state your name?
Sean Callie-Rye, property owner.
You've heard our questions this evening, and,
yes.
And several things seem to be at issue here. Could you tell us why you think I mean, it is a beautiful tree. There's no question about it. But could you tell us why you think it should be removed?
My wife and I had the same discussion, because she just says the same thing. She says, that's a beautiful tree. And I say, it is beautiful. And the problem is over time, it continues to upheave the sidewalk that I put there, and it's the ancillary damage that takes place. It starts to rain, and all of a sudden, the rain then rushes toward the building. And then I've let it go, and I've let it go and let it go before, and what happens is I ruined my wood floor. And then it crept up the walls, and I had to tear down part of the interior of my office space. And I'm the only person that can actually occupy that space, because I figure if there's a fire, frankly, I can just jump out the window. I had to change the orientation of the door. The door doesn't open out anymore. The door opens in, because over time, as that sidewalk starts to heave, there's a picture in there that in 2007, when I took over the space from the prior tenant, there was only a clearance of about 28 inches. And so that just continues to happen. And so yeah, you just couldn't really get into the door much, so I had to change the orientation of the door. And so it's just a continual problem that's going to happen. And the tree is beautiful, but it just is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and at some point, it's just going to have to come out. And I could probably dig deeper if that's the commission's request, take a look at if there's foundation damage, but it really does abut right against the foundation.
Describe to me again the problem you mentioned, were there a fire, and you said the best way out would be through the window. Why is that?
Well, usually, I mean, I'd assume that you want the door to always open out. Pulling on a door, if there's negative pressure from a fire that's pushing outward, pulling in, maybe if it's a stronger person, they probably could pull the door. If not, I'd just jump out the window. I really have no choice, frankly. So for me, I'm not going to really actually rent that to somebody else. I'm going to occupy it myself.
Thank you very much.
Oh, if I could make a comment. There was an extended period of time between the application and when we actually received the word. My business partner was dealing with this issue, and he had hand surgery in the process and then went on vacation in the process. And so I don't want anyone to look negatively upon staff or anything like that. Frankly, Rob has been very easy, and even with the recension of everything, has been very good to deal with. And Jocelyn has been great. She's kind of walked me through the whole process, and it's, you know, we've just had, and I deal a lot with cities, and Laurel can let you know that I'm in a government affairs position, and so I do that with the city of San Jose and other municipalities, and so I actually got a really good amount of service from the town of Los Gatos.
Great, that's very nice to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions of the applicant? No? All right. We're going to close the public portion of the hearing then, and do we have any questions of staff, comments, or a motion? Commissioner O'Donnell?
Question of staff. I don't know the building code, but I'm just wondering, because of the tree and now the changing of the way the door opens, is that consistent with the building code? I don't mean insofar as a violation. I'm not looking for a violation. I'm just saying, were you to build this new, would there be, is there any prohibition against the way you open the door?
Well, I think you see doors that open both ways, both in and out. So I don't know from a building code perspective whether or not that's a building code violation. There's also, existing issues, whether it's the ADA or existing buildings where things may not meet the current requirements, but they get as close as they can due to some other impediments. And so that he changed the door just because physically it probably didn't work to open it out, but I don't know that it is a specific violation of building code requirements. We have one person on the commission that might be able to help.
Is that door wheelchair accessible?
We can go to the applicant. I think it is a flat entry, so it's a level entry.
I was just wondering, because the tree is so big, it wasn't readily apparent to me that it would be. I don't mean because of the door opening in. I just simply mean because of the location of the tree. Does anybody know as a fact whether it's, visual fact, that it's wheelchair accessible?
So I would ask Ms. Puga. She may have seen it before the current sidewalk was ripped up.
I don't quite recall if it was ADA compliant. I do know that when I visited it, it was when it was barely raining. So with the steep slope of the tree going down, it would be difficult, and it was quite wet and slippery. But the applicant, Sean, could probably provide more information of a history.
All right, I guess we're going to reopen the public portion of the hearing so that the applicant can answer this question.
The only thing I changed was the orientation of how the door opens. And just so you know, I want to say almost every other door. I can't say definitively for every door in the building. And that's probably at least 20 doors, interior and exterior doors, open out. This is the only one that I know of that opens in because I changed the orientation. I don't know. The tree's always been there. I mean, the tree has been there for some time, so I assume over time I will have to make a narrower and narrower and narrower sidewalk. And I can assume that it was probably wider before. So I think over time the ADA will get worse. I couldn't tell you if it was ADA before. 9 years. 10 in December. Sure.
All right, we'll reclose the public portion of the hearing. Do we have any other questions of staff, comments, or would anyone like to venture a motion? Commissioner O'Donnell?
My motion will be to grant the appeal because the evidence adduced thus far is that the tree, one, is continually impacting the sidewalk on a basis where there will never be a complete recovery for the sidewalk. Secondly, as the tree grows, the access will substantially be impaired, and including impairment for the disabled. The tree is just, should never have been planted there. It's a beautiful tree, and I really, it's very hard to make the motion, but I think the tree is in the wrong place. We can't move the building. So the standards of review for the permits are as set forth in 2910-0990, and I believe the standards are met pursuant to the reasons I've just stated. So that would be the motion.
Commissioner Badami?
I'll second the motion.
Commissioner Kane?
To the maker of the motion, internal to your motion is the staff's recommendation that the canopy replacement shall be provided pursuant to the town code requirement. Thank you.
Yes, and I have assumed in my motion that that would operate automatically. It need not be part of the motion.
That is in the conditions of approval.
Before we vote, I'm personally going to make a comment. As this has been based on ADA compliance, I would assume that quite immediately that the sidewalk would be made ADA accessible. And I would also like you to consider your statement concerning the doors. Quite honestly, for a person that is in a wheelchair, a door that pushes in is more accessible for them than one that pulls out. So if that is something that you are looking at in your building, and again, that is what we're basing this approval on, I would expect that that would be something you would consider and that we would see repaired on your facility quite immediately. That said, we have a motion and a second. Oh, sorry, Commissioner O'Donnell.
I just want to make it clear that the motion is not solely based on ADA. It was based on the other things I mentioned too. But I mean, I agree with the comment.
I was just saying that was a big part of the conversation, so I would like to make sure that that is something that's corrected.
So that's not part of the motion, though? Okay.
Well, it's going to have to be. I just want to make sure that it's brought up, that I find it to be a very important part of this. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Okay. Passes unanimously. Do we have any appeal?
We do. Anyone who's not satisfied with the decision of the Planning Commission can appeal that decision to the Town Council. Forms are available in the clerk's office. There's a fee for filing the appeal, and the appeal must be filed within 10 days.
Right, thank you. Do we have a report from the Director of Community Development?
Yes, on March 17th, the Town Council approved a conditional use permit for Hillbrook School with modified conditions. They denied both appeals and substantially modified all of the conditions. So, but I do want to comment that the Planning Commission's hard work and its review of each of those conditions really provided the council a firm basis under which they made their decision. So that's all. That's now done. And then secondly, I just want to remind the commission to ask your friends who are interested in serving with the town that we have opportunities on boards and commissions, everything ranging from arts and culture to community and senior services, as well as the newly formed Plan Development Study Committee. So if you know of someone who might be interested in serving in a volunteer capacity, applications are due April 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any members of the commission have any other items to discuss? If no, meeting adjourned.